Mom kicked me out of our house for her BF who needed my room as his office, and she sold all my belongings to fund his business ideas, but now she lost everything in a crypto scam. I need to get this off my chest because I'm watching someone I love turn into a stranger right in front of me. You know how people always warn you about manipulative people who worm their way into relationships and completely change someone? I used to think those stories were exaggerated, maybe even made up for attention. But now I'm living through it, and I can't believe how fast my relationship with my mom, 48F, fell apart. I'm 23, and until recently, I thought nothing could ever come between us. I was wrong. We were incredibly close, the kind of mother-daughter duo that made other people jealous. This wasn't just your typical mom's my best friend situation. We had something real and deep, forged in the worst kind of tragedy. When my dad died 7 years ago, I was only 16, trying to deal with high school while dealing with the loss of my father. Mom was barely functioning herself, but somehow we became each other's lifeline. My sister Carol, 21F, was there too, but she dealt with grief differently. While she loved us, she preferred processing things alone in her room, listening to music or studying. So naturally, Mom and I gravitated toward each other even more. We developed this unspoken language. I could tell what Mom was thinking just by the way she sighed, and she knew when I needed a hug before I even realized it myself. We shared everything. Weekend shopping trips, late-night ice cream runs, marathon sessions of terrible reality TV shows that became our guilty pleasure. When I started college, I chose a local university partly because I couldn't imagine being far from her. Last year, Mom started mentioning dating again. It wasn't a shock. 7 years is a long time to be alone, and I could see the loneliness in her eyes when she watched couples walking together in the park or during romantic scenes in movies. Both Carol and I supported her completely. We knew Dad would have wanted her to find happiness again. He was that kind of person who always put others' joy before his own. Mom went on several dates, mostly with men she met through friends or work. Some were nice enough, but nothing clicked. They'd go out once or twice, and that would be it. We'd laugh about the awkward moments over wine, and life would continue as normal. Then 3 months ago, Jack entered our lives. I wish I could go back in time and stop that first date from ever happening. But I had no way of knowing that this man would systematically destroy the beautiful relationship I had with my mother and turn our peaceful home into a battlefield of manipulation and guilt. From the moment I met Jack, every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong with this guy. You know how sometimes you meet someone and just know they're bad news? That was Jack. He showed up to our house in wrinkled clothes that looked like they hadn't seen an iron in years, and within minutes he was sprawled across our couch like he owned the place. Mom introduced him with such pride in her voice, but all I could see was a middle-aged deadbeat who'd somehow convinced my intelligent, hard-working mother that he was worth her time. The red flags were everywhere. He didn't have a job, claimed he was between opportunities, and kept talking about these mysterious business ventures that were supposedly going to make him rich. I'm not stupid. I know what unemployed with no prospects looks like, and Jack was the dictionary definition. I really tried to give him a fair chance, mostly because I hadn't seen my mom smile like that since before Dad died. She was practically glowing in those first few weeks, always humming to herself and fixing her hair more often. I kept telling myself that maybe there was something special about him that I just couldn't see. But that optimism died pretty quickly when Jack started treating our house like his personal hotel. He would show up unannounced and stay for days at a time, emptying our fridge and leaving beer cans everywhere. Mom would leave for work in the morning, and Jack would still be in his pajamas, stretched out on the couch with bags of chips and energy drinks scattered around him. He'd still be there when she got home, in the exact same position, except now he'd be surrounded by even more mess. The worst part? He'd expect her to clean it all up, and she actually would. This successful woman who raised 2 daughters and ran her own department at work was suddenly picking up after a grown man who contributed absolutely nothing to our household. The more time passed, the more Jack made himself at home. He had a favorite spot on our couch that had practically molded to his body shape. The TV was always blaring some mindless reality show, or he'd be scrolling through TikTok with the volume turned up way too loud, laughing at videos while I tried to work from home. He never bought groceries or contributed to bills, but he sure had no problem sending my mom to the store for his specific brand of beer or asking her to order takeout. I couldn't walk through my own living room without having to navigate around his feet propped up on our coffee table or dodge the mess of snack wrappers he left everywhere. When I'd try to talk to Mom about it, she'd wave it off with excuses like he's networking or he's researching investment opportunities. But I never once saw him do anything that looked remotely like job hunting or business planning. The only thing he was investing in was making our couch permanently smell like beer and cheap cologne. I tried everything I could think of to make my mom see what was happening. I'd point out how he never contributed to anything, How he treated our home like his personal man cave, how he was clearly taking advantage of her generosity. But she had an excuse ready for everything. He's going through a rough patch, she'd say, or he just needs someone to believe in him. I gave him chance after chance, hoping maybe he'd prove me wrong, but months went by and nothing changed. If anything, he got more comfortable being useless. The guy wasn't even pretending to look for work anymore. He'd openly brag about how he was too smart for regular jobs and how he was waiting for the right opportunity to come along. Meanwhile, my mom was working overtime to support his lazy lifestyle, and he didn't show an ounce of guilt about it. I started trying to approach the situation more diplomatically, thinking maybe if I showed interest in his plans, he'd reveal just how empty they were. So I'd casually ask about his job search whenever he was sprawled on our couch, usually surrounded by his usual mountain of empty beer cans. Big mistake. These simple questions would trigger these long, nonsensical monologues that made me want to bang my head against the wall. He'd lean forward, beer in hand, and start talking about his latest sure thing. Sometimes it was cryptocurrency, other times it was some vague tech startup idea, or my personal favorite, his plan to become a social media influence consultant despite barely being able to work his own phone properly. The most infuriating part was how he'd act like he was sharing some profound wisdom with me, like I should be taking notes or something. He'd go on these endless rants about how the system was designed to keep visionaries like him down. Rich coming from a guy who hadn't submitted a single job application in months. He had this whole conspiracy theory about how traditional employment was a scam, and how people like him, self-proclaimed geniuses who couldn't be bothered to hold down a regular job, were actually the smart ones. He'd wave his beer around, getting more animated as he talked about how the school system had failed him because he was too much of an independent thinker to conform. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there thinking about how this independent thinker couldn't even independently buy his own groceries. One evening, after listening to him ramble for what felt like hours about his latest $1 million idea, some ridiculous app that would definitely revolutionize something or other, I finally snapped. I'd just gotten home from a long day at my actual job, only to find him in his usual spot, already several beers deep into another one of his rants. He was going on and on about how he was too intelligent for regular employment, and I couldn't take it anymore. I asked him the obvious question: if he was such a genius, why couldn't he manage to find even a basic job? The look he gave me could have curdled milk. He launched into this condescending speech about how corporations only want mindless drones who follow orders, not innovative thinkers like him. The irony of this man, who spent his days watching TikTok videos and mooching off my mom, calling anyone else mindless, was apparently lost on him. What happened next showed me just how far gone my mom was. She came storming into the room and started yelling at me, defending this leech who was bleeding her dry. This was my mom, the woman who had always been my biggest supporter, my best friend, the person who taught me to stand up for myself and never let anyone take advantage of me. Now here she was, screaming at her own daughter for daring to question her unemployed boyfriend's delusions of grandeur. The last time she'd raised her voice at me like that was when I was 12 and had snuck out to a friend's house without telling her. Now she was treating me like I'd committed some horrible crime just for pointing out the obvious about Jack. I stood there in shock, watching my mother transform into someone I barely recognized. This wasn't the strong, sensible woman who raised me. This was someone who had been completely manipulated by a man she'd known for less than half a year. Jack just sat there with this smug look on his face, like he'd won something. That's when it really hit me: he had won. He'd managed to drive the first real wedge between my mother and me, and he was actually proud of it. I could see it in the way he smirked behind his beer can, how he casually threw his arm around my mom's shoulders as she lectured me about respecting him. The man who contributed nothing to our household had somehow convinced my mother that I was the problem. After that fight, our house became like a minefield. I couldn't say a single word about Jack without my mom jumping to his defense. If I mentioned that he'd left dishes in the sink for days, she'd snap that I was being petty. If I pointed out that he was eating food I'd bought with my own money, she'd accuse me of being stingy. But how could I stay quiet? This wasn't just about him being lazy anymore. I was watching this man systematically drain my mother's resources while she made excuse after excuse for him. He'd borrow money from her for these supposed business ventures, promise to pay her back when he made it big, and then conveniently forget about it. She was even paying for his phone bill because he claimed he needed it for networking opportunities, which apparently meant watching YouTube videos at full volume all day. Then came the announcement that changed everything: Jack was moving in. My mom presented it like it was this wonderful development in their relationship, but I knew the truth: he'd probably gotten kicked out of wherever he was staying before and needed a new place to freeload. Before Jack, we had a system that worked perfectly. It was just mom and me most of the time, with Carol stopping by on weekends when she wasn't busy with college. Mom and I split everything down the middle: rent, utilities, groceries, household supplies, everything. We'd sit down at the beginning of each month, go through all the bills together, and work out who owed what. But Jack's arrival turned our carefully balanced household upside down. Suddenly our grocery bill doubled, but our contributor count didn't. This man would demolish an entire week's worth of groceries in days. He'd drink all the coffee I'd bought for my morning commute, use up all the hot water with his hour-long showers, and leave every light in the house on 24/7 while he binge-watched TV shows. Our utility bills skyrocketed because he was home all day, running the AC at full blast and keeping multiple devices plugged in and charging. And did he offer to chip in for any of it? Of course not. He acted like paying bills was beneath him, like his mere presence in our home was some kind of gift we should be grateful for. What really got to me was watching my mom struggle with the increased expenses while Jack acted like it was his right to live off our hard work. I was essentially subsidizing this grown man's lifestyle because half of what I paid for bills and groceries was going toward his consumption. Every time I opened the fridge to find my meal prep containers empty because Jack had helped himself to my food, or came home to find him using my laptop because his phone was dead, I felt my blood pressure rise. I kept hoping that living with us full-time would force him to get his act together. Maybe Mom would finally see how much of a burden he was and give him an ultimatum about finding work. But I was being naive. Instead of pushing him to be more responsible, moving in just made Jack more comfortable with his parasitic lifestyle. He started treating our home like his personal kingdom, spreading his belongings everywhere, turning the living room into his office for his non-existent business ventures. He even had the nerve to complain about the brand of coffee we bought, suggesting Mom should buy the expensive kind he preferred, with her money, of course. Meanwhile, I was watching my savings dwindle because I was essentially paying to support not just myself and help my mom, but also this deadbeat who had inserted himself into our lives. Every morning, I'd leave for work at 7:30 a.m., stepping around his mess in the living room where he'd be passed out on the couch, surrounded by evidence of his late-night snacking and drinking. When I'd return at 5:30 p.m., it was like looking at a before and after photo where nothing had changed except the quantity of trash. He'd be in the exact same position, maybe shifted slightly to the left, with a fresh collection of beer bottles and empty chip bags around him. The TV would be playing some mind-numbing reality show, and he'd barely acknowledge my existence except to ask if my mom was coming home soon, probably because he wanted her to pick up more beer on her way back. The worst part was watching my mom come home tired from a full day of work, only to immediately start cleaning up after him like she was his personal maid. She'd pick up his beer bottles, wash his dishes, even do his laundry when he'd finally change clothes after wearing the same thing for days. This was my breaking point. I couldn't stand watching this man treat my mother like a servant while he contributed absolutely nothing to our household. After a particularly rough day of coming home to find he'd somehow managed to dirty every dish in the kitchen making himself a snack, I decided it was time for a serious conversation with my mom. I waited for a Saturday morning when Jack was still sleeping off his usual Friday night drinking session. Mom and I used to have our coffee together on Saturday mornings, one of our old traditions that Jack had mostly ruined, but I managed to catch her alone this time. I had everything planned out in my head, all the points I wanted to make about how unfair this situation had become. I showed her our utility bills from before and after Jack moved in, they'd nearly doubled. I broke down our grocery expenses, pointing out how we were spending more money but somehow had less food in the house than ever. I reminded her that I was basically paying to support Jack too, since my contribution to bills was now covering his excessive use of everything. I tried to be gentle but firm, explaining how it hurt to see her working so hard while he couldn't even be bothered to put his own dishes in the dishwasher. The moment I saw her face hardening, I knew this wasn't going to go well. She immediately got defensive and tried to deflect by bringing up Carol, saying it wasn't fair that I never complained about my sister not contributing financially. I couldn't believe she was making that comparison. Carol was a full-time student who came home occasionally on weekends, always cleaned up after herself, and even helped with grocery shopping sometimes. She'd spent her breaks doing household repairs that Jack should have been helping with but was too busy to handle. When Carol stayed with us, she did her own laundry, cooked meals for everyone, and never expected Mom to wait on her hand and foot. The fact that my mom was trying to compare her responsible daughter to her deadbeat boyfriend showed just how far Jack's manipulation had gone. I spent over an hour trying to reason with her, showing her bank statements, pointing out how our household dynamics had shifted, explaining how Jack's presence was affecting not just our finances but our relationship too. I tried appealing to her logical side, the side that had always taught me about financial responsibility and self-respect. But it was like talking to a wall. Every point I made was met with either a defense of Jack or an accusation that I was being selfish and unsupportive. This wasn't just one conversation either. Over the next few weeks, I tried different approaches. I attempted to discuss it when she seemed in a good mood. When we were out shopping together, on the rare occasions Jack didn't tag along, even once when she mentioned being worried about money. Each time, I thought maybe this would be the moment she'd see reason. I gathered evidence, researched local job opportunities that would be perfect for Jack, even offered to help him with his resume, not that he'd ever accept help from me. But every attempt ended the same way, with Mom shutting down the conversation and telling me their relationship wasn't my business, even though his presence was affecting every aspect of my life too. My final attempt to talk to my mom about Jack turned into the conversation that would destroy our relationship forever. I had just gotten home from work and found Jack, as usual, sprawled on the couch surrounded by his mess. Mom was in the kitchen making dinner, for him, of course, and I decided to try one last time to make her understand my concerns. But the moment I started talking about Jack's unemployment and his constant freeloading, she completely lost it. It wasn't just anger, it was like 7 months of Jack's manipulation came pouring out all at once. She started screaming about how I was trying to ruin her chance at happiness, how I was being selfish and controlling. According to her, I was just a jealous daughter who couldn't handle seeing her mother with someone new. She threw everything at me, how I was immature, how I was trying to keep her lonely, how I needed to grow up and accept that she deserved love. Then apparently, Jack had been telling her stories about how I was treating him. He claimed I was constantly hostile, that I made him feel unwelcome in his own home, funny how it became his home when he wasn't paying a cent toward it, that I was deliberately trying to drive him away. I stood there in shock as she listed off all these supposed offenses I'd committed against precious Jack. According to him, I slammed doors when he was around, made rude comments under my breath, and gave him dirty looks. The reality? I mostly just ignored him because I couldn't stand watching him take advantage of my mother. But Jack had spun this whole narrative about me being this terrible, hostile person, and my mom had bought into every word of it. What hurt the most was how easily she believed him over me. This was the woman who had known me my entire life, who had been my best friend, my confidant, my support system through everything. But now, after just 7 months, she was taking the word of this unemployed freeloader over her own daughter. Every time I tried to defend myself or explain that Jack was lying, she'd cut me off with another accusation. It was like arguing with a stranger wearing my mother's face. And then came the words that would change everything. If you can't learn to accept Jack and be nice to him, you need to move out. Just like that, she was choosing him over me. We had a plan. I was supposed to stay until March, until my 24th birthday. It was all worked out. I just started my first real job after college, the pay was barely enough to live on, and we had specifically agreed that living at home while I saved up was the smart financial move. But now, in November, with barely any savings and winter coming on, she was telling me to get out because I wouldn't play nice with her unemployed boyfriend. The worst part? This was exactly what Jack wanted. In just 7 months, he had managed to turn my mother against me so completely that she was willing to throw her own daughter out into the cold. All those years of love and trust and friendship meant nothing compared to the lies of a man who contributed nothing but empty promises and beer bottles to our household. I'd been replaced by someone who hadn't even been in our lives long enough to know what my mother's favorite flower was or how she took her coffee in the morning. The more my mom talked, the clearer it became that this wasn't a spontaneous decision. The way she had all these rehearsed responses ready, how she kept using phrases that sounded exactly like something Jack would say, it was obvious that they had discussed this before. When I brought up our agreement about March, she dismissed it like it had meant nothing to her. Like all our careful planning and discussions about my future had been erased the moment Jack decided he wanted my room. The excuses she gave me were almost worse than the eviction itself. According to her, I was too old to be living at home, even though just a few months ago she had been the one insisting I stay and save money. She said I needed to grow up and take responsibility for myself, rich coming from someone who was supporting a fully grown man who spent his days watching TikTok videos. Every time I tried to remind her of our plans, of how we'd worked out this timeline together, she'd cut me off with another lecture about how I needed to stop sabotaging her chance at happiness. As if pointing out Jack's complete lack of contribution to our household was sabotage rather than just stating obvious facts. I tried everything I could think of to reason with her. I showed her my bank account, proving that I didn't have enough saved for first and last month's rent plus security deposit. I reminded her how expensive apartments were in our area, how moving would probably mean having to live in a less safe neighborhood or much further from my job. I even tried appealing to her maternal instincts, explaining how difficult it would be for me to suddenly start living on my own with no preparation. But it was like talking to a wall. She had an answer for everything, and none of those answers involved any concern for my well-being. Then came the final proof that this whole thing was Jack's master plan. Jack needs an office for his business ventures, she announced, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The room I'd had since we moved into this house was going to become an office for a man who hadn't worked a day in his life. He needed my space for his imaginary business, and my mother was perfectly fine with displacing her own daughter to accommodate his delusions. That was when I knew with absolute certainty that this had been his idea all along. He had manipulated my mother into kicking out her own daughter so he could have more space to pretend he was a businessman. The woman standing in front of me wasn't the mother I knew anymore. My mom would have never put a man she barely knew ahead of her daughter's well-being. But Jack had somehow managed to completely rewrite our relationship in just a few months. In her eyes, I wasn't her daughter anymore, the person who had supported her through Dad's death, who had been her best friend for years, who had helped her rebuild her life. Now I was just an inconvenience, an obstacle standing between Jack and his latest scheme. He had convinced her that her own daughter's stability and safety were less important than his need for an office where he could presumably continue doing absolutely nothing all day. I've always believed that begging someone to want you just strips away whatever dignity you have left. Looking at my mother that day, seeing how completely Jack had poisoned her against me, I knew that no amount of pleading would change her mind. I wasn't about to give Jack the satisfaction of seeing me break down or beg to stay. I was certain he would have loved that, would have used it as more ammunition to paint me as the immature daughter who couldn't let go. So I just looked my mother in the eye and asked her one final time if this was really what she wanted. When she said yes without even a moment's hesitation, I felt the last thread of our relationship snap. I had to take time off work, time I couldn't really afford, to look at places. Every empty apartment I viewed was a reminder of how unprepared I was for this. I'd been responsibly saving money, helping with bills at home, planning for a careful transition in March. Now here I was in November, frantically trying to find somewhere, anywhere, that would accept a tenant with barely enough savings for a security deposit. Carol was incredible during this time. She skipped classes to help me pack, called apartments for me while I was at work, and tried repeatedly to reason with our mother. But Mom had made her choice, and that choice was Jack. I ended up finding a tiny studio apartment in a part of town I'd never really wanted to live in. It was the kind of place where you can hear every conversation your neighbors have and the water pressure is a joke, but it was all I could afford on such short notice. The landlord took pity on me after I explained my situation and let me split the security deposit into 2 payments. Moving in was depressing, my furniture from home barely fit, the walls were this sickly beige color I couldn't paint over, and the whole place smelled like old carpet. But at least it was mine, and I didn't have to watch Jack sprawl across my couch or listen to him talk about his latest get-rich-quick scheme. Those first few weeks were the hardest. I would check my phone, wondering if today would be the day my mom would realize what she'd done, telling me she'd finally seen through Jack's manipulation, asking me to come home. I even rehearsed in my head what I'd say when she called to apologize. But that call never came. Days turned into weeks, and my phone remained silent. No texts asking if I was okay, no calls to see if I needed anything, not even a message asking if I'd settled into my new place. The mother who used to text me multiple times a day just to check in or share funny memes had completely ghosted me. It was like the moment I moved out, I stopped existing in her world. Carol would visit me and try to avoid talking about Mom, but I could see in her face that things at home weren't good. She'd get this guilty look whenever she mentioned being at the house, like she felt bad for still having a relationship with both of us. Either way, the message is clear, she chose him over me, and she's sticking to that choice. Update 1. Life after being kicked out became an exercise in trying to rebuild myself from scratch. Picked up extra shifts when I could, and tried to make my tiny apartment feel like home. I hit a really low point about 2 weeks after moving out. I broke down and called her, hoping that maybe she'd been wanting to reach out too but didn't know how. The phone rang and rang, eventually going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message, what could I even say? Hey Mom, just wondering if you care that your daughter is barely scraping by after you chose your deadbeat boyfriend over her? I waited for days, thinking she'd at least call back to see why I'd called. Nothing. The woman who used to panic if I didn't answer her texts within an hour couldn't be bothered to return her daughter's call. My little sister really stepped up, spending almost every weekend at my place, bringing home-cooked meals, and helping me adapt to living alone. She tried to make my sterile studio apartment feel more like home, hanging pictures and adding little touches that made the place feel less lonely. But she was also my unwitting connection to what was happening back at home, and what she told me made me realize just how completely Jack had won. They didn't waste any time erasing me from the house. Within days of me leaving, they had cleared out my room entirely. The space I'd lived in for years, where I'd cried over my first breakup, studied for my college exams, and processed my father's death, was transformed into Jack's office. Carol said they painted over my carefully chosen wall color with some bland beige that Jack picked out, replaced my furniture with a desk he found on Facebook Marketplace, and set it up like some wannabe executive suite. But the worst part, the absolute knife to the heart, was what they did with my belongings. The things I'd left behind, mostly stuff I couldn't fit in my small apartment or couldn't move on such short notice, my own mother sold them off like they were nothing. My old bookshelf that Dad had helped me put together when I was in high school? Sold. The winter clothes I'd been planning to come back for? Gone to some stranger on Facebook Marketplace. Even the box of my high school memorabilia that had been in my closet, photos, yearbooks, little keepsakes from that time in my life, all of it sold off or thrown away. Carol said they did it over a weekend, like they were having some kind of erase all traces of my daughter yard sale. But Mom took all the money from selling my things and handed it straight to Jack for his latest investment opportunity. My childhood memories were liquidated to fund whatever scam had caught his eye that week. The betrayal of it all was almost too much to process. This wasn't just about getting rid of some old stuff, this was my mother systematically erasing any evidence that I had ever lived in that house. After hearing about the yard sale, I had to ask Carol to stop giving me updates about what was happening at home. Every new piece of information was like reopening a wound that was trying to heal. I was working on building my own life, trying to move forward, and hearing about how easily my mother had erased me was making that impossible. She had made her choice crystal clear, Jack was her priority now, and I was just a chapter of her life that she was ready to close. Fine. If she could forget about me so easily, then I would have to learn to do the same. I told Carol I appreciated her keeping me in the loop, but I needed to focus on my future, not on the mother who had so easily discarded me for a man who couldn't even hold down a job. The months following my forced exodus from home became a crash course in adult survival. I picked up every extra shift I could get at work, learned to cook cheap meals that could last several days, and became an expert at finding free entertainment. My tiny apartment slowly started feeling less like an emergency shelter and more like my actual home. The biggest breakthrough came when I landed a new job at a marketing firm. The position wasn't exactly my dream role, but it came with better health insurance and a salary increase that meant I could finally start building an emergency fund instead of living paycheck to paycheck. For the first time since that awful November night when my mom chose Jack over me, I felt like I could breathe. I even started thinking about taking some online classes to boost my qualifications further. Then came the conversation that showed me karma might actually be real. Carol showed up at my apartment one Sunday afternoon, looking uncomfortable and fidgeting with her phone. She had that same expression she used to get when we were kids and she had to tell Mom about a bad grade. "I know you said you didn't want updates about Mom," she started, "but I think you need to hear this." The fact that Carol, who had respected my no mom updates rule for months, felt compelled to break it told me this was serious. According to Carol, our mother had done something she'd never done before. She'd asked to borrow money from her college-aged daughter. Not a small amount either. She needed help covering the utility bills that were past due. Carol said Mom had tried to play it off casually, like she just needed a brief loan until her next paycheck, but the request had set off alarm bells. Our mother had always been proud of providing for us, had worked hard to make sure we never went without, and now she was trying to borrow money from her student daughter who worked part-time at the campus bookstore? When Carol pressed for details, the true extent of the financial disaster became clear. Without my contribution to the household expenses, Mom was struggling to cover everything on her own. But that wasn't the real problem. The real issue was that she wasn't just supporting herself anymore. She was supporting Jack and funding his endless parade of get-rich-quick schemes. He had convinced her to invest in everything from cryptocurrency to dropshipping businesses to some kind of social media marketing pyramid scheme. Every paycheck, he had a new opportunity that needed just a little more capital to take off. Sometimes it was a few $100s, sometimes more, but it was always something that would supposedly multiply their investment tenfold. The more Carol told me, the clearer the picture became. Jack hadn't just manipulated my mother into kicking me out, he'd orchestrated it specifically to have more control over her finances. With me gone, there was no one to question why Mom's savings were dwindling, no one to point out how each new investment opportunity was just another way for Jack to drain her resources. He had successfully isolated her from the one person who would have called him out on his schemes. The money from selling my belongings had just been the start. Now he had direct access to her entire paycheck, and he was bleeding her dry with promises of future wealth that would never materialize. What made it even more infuriating was how predictable it all was. This was exactly the kind of thing I had tried to warn my mother about. Jack had shown his true colors from the beginning. Carol spent nearly a week trying to convince me to reach out to Mom. She kept saying things like maybe she'll listen to you now and she might be ready to hear the truth. I knew better. Nothing had changed except that now Mom was facing the consequences of her choices. But Carol looked so worried, so desperate for someone to help fix this situation, that I finally gave in. I tried calling Mom first, even though I knew exactly how that would go. Predictably, my calls went straight to voicemail. Same mother, same behavior, she could ignore me just as easily now as she had when she first kicked me out. Carol wasn't willing to give up though. She had always been the optimistic one in the family. So one evening while we were having dinner in my tiny apartment, she pulled out her phone and called Mom. I listened as they had a normal conversation for a few minutes, then she said, "Mom, someone wants to talk to you," and thrust the phone at me before I could protest. The moment Mom heard my voice, the line went so quiet I thought she might have hung up. I pushed through the awkward silence, explaining that Carol had told me about the financial situation and that I was concerned. I tried to keep my voice neutral, professional even, like I was discussing this with a stranger rather than the woman who had raised me. I had barely gotten 3 sentences out when the explosion came. Mom started screaming so loudly that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Her words came out in a furious torrent, all focused on how Carol had betrayed her trust by telling me anything. Then she turned her rage on me. According to her, I was just a jealous, bitter person who couldn't stand to see her happy. She started throwing every personal insult she could think of, how I was alone because I was too difficult to love, how I had never managed to maintain a relationship because I was too controlling, how I was just angry because Jack had shown her what real love looked like. She even brought up my last breakup from 2 years ago, twisting it to fit her narrative that I was just a sad, lonely person trying to ruin her happiness. The whole time she was ranting, I could hear Jack in the background, obviously egging her on. His voice was muffled but distinct, feeding her new angles of attack. It was like listening to a ventriloquist act where you could clearly hear both voices. Every time Mom would pause for breath, Jack would murmur something, and she'd launch into a new tirade. When she started in on how I had always been an ungrateful daughter and how Jack was more family to her than I had ever been, I ended the call. There's only so many times you can let your mother stab you in the heart before you have to walk away. Carol had heard everything. The phone volume had been loud enough that the whole ugly scene had played out in stereo in my small apartment. She sat there with tears running down her face, apologizing over and over for pushing me to make the call. I could see the guilt eating at her. She had genuinely believed that Mom might listen this time, that maybe the financial pressure would have opened her eyes to Jack's manipulation. Instead, she had just given Mom another opportunity to show exactly where her loyalties lay. I told Carol it wasn't her fault, but I was done. Mom had made her position crystal clear, again. She had kicked me out saying I was an adult who needed to handle myself. Well, fine. She was 25 years older than me, with decades more life experience. If I could figure out how to survive on my own after being thrown out with no warning, then she could figure out her own financial mess. I wasn't going to subject myself to more abuse just because she was finally facing the consequences of choosing Jack over her daughter. The look on Carol's face nearly broke me. She was caught in the middle of this mess, trying to maintain relationships with both her sister and her mother while watching our family fall apart. But I couldn't keep throwing myself against this wall just because Carol wanted to believe Mom could change. Some people don't want to be saved, they just want to drag you down with them. Life settled into a new normal after that failed intervention. Carol became a constant presence in my life, showing up every weekend with groceries or takeout, sometimes just to hang out and watch bad movies together. She'd sleep on my cramped pull-out couch, complain about my apartment's terrible water pressure, and help me slowly transform my small space into something that felt more like home. We grew closer than we'd ever been when we lived together, ironically brought together by the mess our mother had created. Carol never mentioned Mom directly, but I could tell when she'd had a rough weekend at the house. I never asked, and she never told, but we both knew things weren't getting better at home. Then came the evening when my phone lit up with my mother's number. I had just gotten home from one of the worst days at work, 3 deadlines, a crashed computer, and a client meeting from hell. I was stretched out on my couch, still in my work clothes, trying to decompress when her name appeared on my screen. I rejected the call without hesitation. But she kept trying. Every few minutes, my phone would light up again. 2 calls, then 5, then 8. Each time, I hit reject with a little more force, feeling my hard-won peace crumbling under this renewed assault. The next morning, I was rushing around my apartment trying to get ready for work, already running late because my ancient coffee maker had chosen the day to die. My phone rang with an unknown number, and I answered it automatically, thinking it might be the client from yesterday. Instead, I heard my mother's voice, coming through the speaker. The sound stopped me in my tracks. I hadn't heard her cry since Dad's funeral. My first instinct was to hang up, to protect myself from whatever manipulation was coming. After all, The last time I'd tried to help, she'd responded by attacking every insecurity I had. But something in her voice made me pause, my finger hovering over the end call button. I should have trusted my first instinct. I should have remembered that crying was just another tool in the manipulation toolbox, right next to guilt and insults. But no matter how much someone hurts you, when you hear your mother crying, some deep-rooted part of you wants to make it better. It's like muscle memory. So I stayed on the line, listening to her sob, feeling my carefully constructed emotional walls starting to crack. I had spent months building up those defenses, teaching myself not to care about what was happening in my old home, learning to live with the knowledge that my mother had chosen Jack over me. But here she was, crying into my ear like she used to when she missed Dad, and I felt myself being pulled back into her orbit against my better judgment. Through her tears, my mother told me a story of financial disaster that would have been comical if it wasn't so tragic. Jack had convinced her to invest in some cryptocurrency project he'd found through his online business connections. He'd promised it was the next Bitcoin, guaranteed to make them millionaires within months. My mother, who had always lectured me about being careful with money, who had taught me to save and budget, had fallen for the oldest scam in the crypto playbook, a rug pull. She'd lost everything when the creators of the project disappeared with everyone's money. But that wasn't even the worst part. As she continued talking, the true extent of the disaster emerged. Jack hadn't just convinced her to invest their available cash, he talked her into borrowing money from everywhere he could think of. She'd maxed out credit cards, taken out personal loans, even borrowed against her 401k. All because Jack had promised her that this investment would multiply their money by at least 10 times. He'd shown her flashy websites with fake testimonials, connected her with supposed investors who were probably just other scammers, and painted pictures of the wealthy lifestyle they'd soon be living. Now all that money was gone, disappeared into digital wallets they'd never see again, and she was drowning in debt. I sat there in my tiny apartment, listening to my mother sob about her financial ruin, and felt absolutely nothing. Well, not nothing, I felt vindicated. Every warning I'd given her about Jack had come true. Every red flag I'd pointed out had turned into exactly the disaster I'd predicted. I reminded her of all the times I'd tried to tell her that Jack's business plans were nothing but hot air, how I'd warned her that he was just using her for money. Well, I said, I assume you finally kicked him out after this disaster? The silence that followed that question said everything. It's not Jack's fault, she finally mumbled, sounding exactly like the abuse victims who defend their abusers. He didn't know it was going to be a scam. He lost money too. I had to laugh at that. What money had Jack lost? He'd never had any money to lose. Every cent that disappeared had come from my mother's pockets. I reminded her that real investments come with risk disclaimers, not guaranteed returns. Real business opportunities don't require you to drain your retirement account. But Jack had promised her the moon and stars, had acted like this was a sure thing, and she'd believed him over her own daughter's warnings. When she confirmed that she was still with Jack, still letting him live in my old room that he turned into his office for his non-existent business ventures, I'd heard enough. I told her plainly that I wouldn't give her a single dollar while she was still with the man who had systematically destroyed her finances. That's when the real show started. Her tears dried up instantly, replaced by the defensive anger I'd come to expect. Suddenly, this whole situation was somehow my fault. If I hadn't been so jealous of her relationship with Jack, if I hadn't forced her to choose between us, if I had just stayed and kept contributing to the household expenses, none of this would have happened. The mental gymnastics were impressive. Somehow, in her Jack warped reality, my refusal to silently watch him take advantage of her had led to this situation. The fact that I wouldn't subsidize her boyfriend's lifestyle with my rent money had somehow caused her to fall for an obvious cryptocurrency scam. She had kicked me out of my home, sold my belongings, and given the money to Jack, but somehow I was the one who had forced her hand. It was like listening to someone describe a completely different reality, one where Jack was an innocent victim of circumstance rather than the architect of her financial ruin. I couldn't help but laugh, a real, genuine laugh at the sheer audacity of what I was hearing. This woman who had thrown me out of my home was now trying to blame me for her bad decisions. I told her exactly what I thought, that she was an adult who had made her own decisions. She had chosen to kick out her daughter who helped with bills and supported Jack who contributed nothing. She had chosen to sell my belongings and give him the money. She had chosen to drain her savings and take out loans for his schemes. Every step that led to this disaster had been her choice, and now she needed to own those choices. That's when the waterworks started again. She pulled out the ultimate guilt trip weapon. I'm your mother. As if that title still meant anything after everything she'd done. She started talking about how family is supposed to stick together and help each other through hard times. Rich coming from the woman who had erased every trace of me from her house the moment I left. I reminded her of all of this. Where was this family helps family attitude when she was selling my belongings? Where was it when she was screening my calls for months? Where was it when she was choosing Jack over her own daughter? Now that she needed money, suddenly she remembered she had a daughter. Suddenly family meant something again. But it wasn't just about helping her. Any money I gave her would go straight to supporting Jack too. I couldn't resist one final dig. I'd rather lose everything I had than help that man check around in my room. Oh sorry, Jack's office. Maybe there's something of mine that you haven't sold yet. The words came out cold, but they felt good. For once, I wasn't the one hurting. For once, I wasn't the one dealing with the consequences of her choices. When she started calling back immediately after I hung up, I felt nothing but satisfaction as I declined call after call. Let her feel what it's like to be ignored by family. Let her experience what it's like to need help and be refused by someone who's supposed to love you. The dozen missed calls that followed felt like victory bells. The aftermath of that phone call confirmed everything I needed to know about my mother's state of mind. She was still completely under Jack's influence, unable or unwilling to see how he had systematically destroyed her life. She hadn't offered a single apology for kicking me out, for selling my belongings, for choosing him over me. Instead, she had tried to twist the narrative to make me the villain in her story. The fact that she could look at her current situation, drowning in debt while supporting an unemployed scammer, and somehow conclude that it was my fault showed just how deep Jack's manipulation went. She didn't deserve my help, and I felt absolutely no guilt about refusing to rescue her from the consequences of her own choices. Carol has been caught in the middle of this mess, trying to maintain relationships with both of us while watching our mother spiral further into financial disaster. She never directly criticizes my decision to refuse help, but I can see the worry in her eyes when she visits. She's torn between her understanding of why I can't enable our mother's choices and her natural instinct to want to fix everything. According to Carol, Jack is still living his same lifestyle, sprawled on the couch, talking about his next big opportunity, while our mother works overtime to keep the lights on. He's still spinning tales about potential investments and business ventures, and somehow, despite losing everything in his last scheme, my mother still believes in his empty promises. It's like watching someone repeatedly touch a hot stove and refuse to acknowledge that it burns. Since that phone call, my mother has tried reaching out several times. Sometimes she calls from different numbers, sometimes she sends guilt-tripping text messages about how much she misses me. She's even tried getting mutual friends to reach out on her behalf. But I've learned my lesson about letting her back into my life. You don't get to throw your daughter away like yesterday's trash and then try to retrieve her when you need financial help. I've found my own kind of peace in this situation. My apartment might be small, but it's mine, and nobody can kick me out of it. My job might not be perfect, but I'm building a career on my own terms. I'm learning who I am without the weight of trying to protect someone who doesn't want to be protected.